To understand the presidency of JFK, we need to take a look at the Cold War, or that period of tension between 1945 and 1991 that centered around the USA and Russia and their competing ambitions. During World War II, the Allied powers of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the USA fought against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The USA did not enter the war until Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan in December of 1941. Despite the fact that both the USA and Russia fought on the same side in World War II, the relationship between the pair was very tense at the conclusion of the war in 1945. This was because of ideological differences in the way that these countries thought governments should function and countries should be run. On the one hand, the American political system was a democracy, a system of representative government that allowed people the freedom to stand for election and to vote. To quote roughly from a speech that the American President Lincoln made in 1863, a free nation involved government by the people, for the people. The America of 1945 was also a capitalist society, a society in which economic freedom permitted individuals to profit from the goods and services that they produced for consumers. The people who owned the means of production, that is, the owners of factories and mines, and the people who controlled and sold people's services, were capitalists. And capitalists were very motivated to keep production high because the more that they produced, the richer they became. The economic freedom of capitalists in societies with representative government meant that some people might become very rich, while others remained very poor. By 1945, legal protections and some welfare measures had softened somewhat the harshest effects of capitalism. For instance, the government had stepped in to assist people in the Great Depression of the 1930s, and some welfare measures remained, but the capitalist system was far from perfect. In 1945, Russia was a communist country, which basically meant that the government took control of the economic system and people were not free to set up private businesses for their individual profit. They certainly weren't citizens that voted governments in or governments out either. Just as there was a lack of political freedom, there was also a lack of economic freedom for individuals. While some people have argued that there are no communist countries, only socialist countries, we will continue to use the term communism in our discussions about Russia because that is the term most frequently used by politicians and commentators and historians. In 1945, Russia was a country that dominated the Soviet Union, or the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a union of countries or territories that followed or were increasingly forced to follow the Russian political and economic model. So to recap, in 1945, the relationship between the USA and Russia was tense. On the one hand, Americans were extremely mistrustful of Soviet communism, a political and economic system very different from their own capitalist and democratic system. They also disapproved of the harsh measures taken by the Russian leader Joseph Stalin to enforce the obedience of Russian citizens. On the other hand, the Soviets believed that democracy only benefited capitalists and that capitalists were the enemies of the people. In the post-1945 world, Russia expanded its communist system into Eastern Europe. Similarly, the USA worked to establish strong bonds with Western democracies and to strengthen the economies of European nations in the belief that communism was more likely to take off in poor and struggling countries. Russia's satellite states, those countries it supported and increasingly dominated, included Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany by the time that Kennedy was president. In 1945, Winston Churchill, who had served as British Prime Minister during the last few years of World War II, made a speech that fired people's imaginations. Churchill used the term Iron Curtain to capture the deep division between the communist nations of Eastern Europe and the democratic nations of Britain, America, and Western Europe. This is the image that the phrase Iron Curtain captured. It suggests an extremely powerful division that would be difficult to reverse, and later decades certainly showed that this was the case. In his famous 1945 speech, Churchill praised the USA, describing it as a major world power and arguing that it had a special responsibility to protect and strengthen the democratic world. His advice that communism had to be contained, that is, it had to be stopped from spreading any further, greatly influenced John Fitzgerald Kennedy's thinking during his presidency. This policy of containment justified the development of nuclear weaponry in America, and it justified the build-up of other weapons of war. The term arms race has been used to capture the way that the two world powers began to stockpile weapons. While the Americans had brought World War II to an end through the use of an atomic bomb on Japanese territories, the Russians developed and tested their own atom bomb in 1949, an achievement that made the USA far from happy. The reaction of the American President, Truman, was to declare that the USA would begin work on an even more destructive atomic bomb, and in 1952 they dropped a hydrogen bomb on an island in the Pacific Ocean. Under the impact of the bomb, the island completely disappeared and an enormous crater was created in the floor of the ocean. The development of the hydrogen bomb created a great deal of fear in America as people realized its destructive potential. The nuclear weaponry the Americans developed might also be used on them. The space race took place at the same time as the arms race, with each superpower trying to present itself as more technologically advanced than the other. Americans were far from happy when Russia launched the first satellite into space in 1957, and they responded by launching their own satellite in 1959. NASA, the American Space Agency, was also created in 1959. For a time, there was a push for American schoolchildren to do more homework, as some people were concerned that a lack of education had been responsible for the Russians getting their satellite into space before the Americans were able to launch theirs. President Kennedy's declaration in 1961 that the Americans would beat the Russians in the race to the moon proved true. However, Kennedy did not live to see his prediction come true some 8 years later.